Story 1.
The line that shouldn't have been heavy. I've been working as a wetlands technician for just over 11 years now. Most of that time has been spent under contract with the state, rotating between water management districts and occasional federal projects when funding allows. My degree is in environmental science, and my specialty is hydrology, monitoring how water levels, nutrient loads, and seasonal flow patterns affect fragile swamp ecosystems. It's not glamorous work. It's mud samples, dissolved oxygen meters, and spreadsheets that stretch for pages. But it's steady, and it matters. On any given week, I'm either out calibrating songs, checking staff gauges, mapping invasive stands of Brazilian pepper, or logging wildlife observations for restoration reports. I've handled aggressive gators, stepped over cottonmouths without flinching, and worked through heat that feels like it's pressing on your chest. You get used to the smell of tannic water and decay. You learn what's normal out there and what isn't. By the time this happened, I wasn't new. I knew the swamp well enough to trust my instincts. And that's what unsettled me later, because the first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. It was a feeling. Most mornings start before sunrise, especially in the warmer months. The air's cooler then, and the water's calmer. I keep my jumbo chained at a small county launch off a service road. That barely shows up on Google Maps. It's 14 feet of aluminum, flat-bottomed, scuffed from years of scraping over limestone shells and half-submerged logs. I load it the same way every time, cooler with ice packs for samples, field bagged with the YSI meter and spare batteries, clipboard sealed in a plastic sleeve, extra flagging tape in orange and pink. Each sampling site is logged as a GPS point in my handheld uni. I don't rely on memory out there. Everything is coordinates and timestamps. Some sites are marked with faded flagging tied to cypress knees, others with small floating buoys that bob just enough to catch the light. The water in that part of the swamp is dark with tannins, almost tea-colored, but usually clear enough that you can see a foot or to below the surface if the sun's right. There's a rhythm to moving through it. Kill the outboard before you drift too close to a site. Watch for gator eyes, especially in the early light when they're just breaking the surface. Give them space. They'll usually slide off without a fuss if you don't crowd them. I keep a push. Pull across the bow in case I need to ease away quietly. The birds are the constant soundtrack. Ibis squabbling, a distant heron croak, sometimes the splash of something heavy dropping off a bank. After a while, you know what belongs and what doesn't. That morning felt ordinary, routine, exactly how it should have been. The fourth site was about 50 yards off a cypress cluster I'd sampled dozens of times before. The buoy was where it should have been, rocking gently in place. I cut the motor early and let the boat drift in, hooked the retrieval line with my pole, and gave it a steady pull. It stopped halfway. That wasn't unusual. Roots, submerged branches, even thick mats of hydrilla can snag a line. I gave it some slack, let the tension ease, then tried a slow side-to-side motion the way I always do. Usually, you can feel vegetation scrape loose or the line slide free along wood. This felt different. There was weight on it. Yes, but not the dead drag of something caught. It had resistance that shifted slightly when I shifted. Not pulling back, not thrashing, just present. I remember pausing, hands still wrapped around the cord, listening to nothing but insects and distant birds. For a second, I considered cutting the line and logging it as lost equipment. Instead, I leaned back and pulled harder. The tension gave all at once. It wasn't a snap, exactly. More like a slow release, followed by a sudden upward surge that rocked the bow just enough to make me widen my stance. The line slid through my gloves, slick with tannic water, and whatever had been holding it down began rising toward the surface. The water bulged first. A dome pushed up through the dark, stretching the surface film thin and trembling. Then it broke. The smell hit before my brain could process what I was seeing. Not the usual swamp rot. This was sharper, heavier. Something sweet turned wrong. It coated the back of my throat instantly. I gagged before I even understood why. What surface wasn't wood or vegetation? It was rounded, pale beneath the tea-colored water, with a sheen that caught the morning light in a way nothing natural should have. It bobbed once, slow and reluctant, rolling just enough for me to see texture skin stretched tight and discolored. Patches where it seemed to be slipping. The buoy line was looped beneath it. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My arms felt locked in place. Still holding the cord, the boat drifted closer, nudging the shape gently, and it turned a fraction more. That's when I saw what made it unmistakable. I stumbled backward, heel catching on the cooler lid, heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my ears. The air felt thinner. The insects were still buzzing, birds still calling, but everything else narrowed to that thing in the water and the realization settling in behind my eyes like cold weight. It wasn't driftwood. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. The size made that clear before anything else did. Small shoulders, limbs that were too short to belong to an adult. The proportions were unmistakable even through the swelling and discoloration. For a split second, my mind tried to reject it, tried to file it under something explainable, something less catastrophic. But there was no mistaking the shape of a small hand rolling just beneath the surface. The world constricted around that single image. My hearing dulled, like someone had stuffed cotton in my ears. The edges of my vision blurred. I was aware of my own breathing, shallow, fast, almost mechanical. My hands were still gripping the retrieval line, knuckles white beneath wet gloves. Even though I no longer felt the rope, the smell intensified as the boat drifted closer. It coated my tongue. My stomach turned violently, and I leaned over the side just in time. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just reacted. When I straightened, my hands were shaking so badly I had to brace them against the gunwale to steady myself. The boat bumped the body again, gently, and it rotated enough for me to see the face, or what was left visible of it. That was the moment the denial collapsed completely, and everything after that happened on instinct alone. I don't remember starting the engine. 1 second I was staring at it, frozen, and the next I was halfway across the channel. Throttle pushed harder than I ever used in that stretch of water. The boat skipped over chop I didn't even register. My brain had narrowed to one command: get away. I left the line where it was, left the buoy, left the sample. By the time I reached the launch, my hands were still shaking. I tied off without looking at what I was doing and drove home in a kind of stunned silence. No radio, no phone, just the hum of tires and the image replaying behind my eyes. I showered twice. The first time felt pointless. The second time I scrubbed until my skin stung. But the smell sweet and wrong lingered in my head. Not on me, dotting me. I kept catching it when I inhaled, even standing in clean air. It took almost an hour before I picked up my phone. Reporting it meant accepting it was real. A deputy met me back at the launch within an hour. I rode with him to point out the exact coordinates. I left the buoy in place without meaning to, which made it easier for them to find. The rest of that morning blurred into statements, timelines, and the same questions asked in slightly different ways. Had I seen clothing, jewelry, anything distinctive? I kept replaying it, trying to pull details out of shock, but all I could remember clearly was the size. A detective called the next day. He was polite, but direct. They needed to know if I'd touched anything, if the line had been wrapped intentionally, if I'd noticed signs of trauma. I answered what I could. There wasn't much to give. The decomposition was advanced. He said, water accelerates everything. DNA would be difficult. Dental records unlikely. There were no missing child reports locally that matched the estimated time frame. They ran regional checks. Nothing. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, I stopped calling for updates because there weren't any. The case shifted from active to open, and then from open to cold. A small, unclaimed burial handled through the county. I went back to work. I had to, but every time a retrieval line hesitates now, even for a second, something tightens in my chest. I still double-check the water before I pull. I still brace myself for weight that doesn't make sense, because the swamp gave the child up once, and then it kept the rest.
Story 2.
I've worked as a wildlife officer for just under 8 years now, assigned to a district that's mostly swamp and low-lying timber land. My badge says conservation enforcement, but most people just call us game wardens. The job's a mix of education, citations, and the occasional ugly situation when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them. I patrol by truck when I can, by boat when I have to, and on foot more often than I'd like. I've dealt with poachers running illegal trot lines, busted small marijuana grow sites tucked into hammocks, and dismantled more makeshift camps than I can count. You learn what long-term squatters leave behind burn pits ringed with beer cans, fishing lines snarled in trees, cheap tarps bleached by the sun. You also learn how people move when they don't want to be found. The cut of a trail through sawgrass, a tree blazed too fresh to be old. Most of what we find out there is predictable. Illegal, sure, but predictable. The swamp has patterns, and so do the people who try to hide in it. That's why what happened that day unsettled me. It didn't fit the patterns, and I've learned to pay attention when something doesn't fit. That morning started like dozens before it. I launched the department skiff just after 7 a.m. The air already thick, and warm enough to cling to your uniform. Late summer down here doesn't ease you into the day. It sits on your shoulders from the moment you step outside. I ran my standard checks before pushing off. Radio on, volume up. Quick calling to dispatch to log my patrol zone and estimated return time. Sidearm secured, but accessible policy requires it in remote areas, especially when we're checking suspected growth sites or illegal camps. Most folks we deal with are just trying to skirt regulations, but every now and then you run into someone who thinks you're the enemy. Once I cut the motor and drifted into the narrower channels, it was just push-pull and patience. Sawgrass lined the banks and dense walls, blades sharp enough to slice skin if you brush wrong. The mud there has a particular pull to. It's thick, black, and greedy. If you step in the wrong spot without watching your footing, it'll take your boot clean off. The temperature climbed fast. Even under the canopy, the air felt trapped. Mosquitoes gathered the second I stopped moving. I've learned to live with the constant whine in my ears. Cell service drops out. About 2 miles in. After that, you're on radio and your own judgment. Backup could be 30 minutes away on a good day. It was routine patrol. Check marked trails. Look for fresh cuts. Make sure no one's building something they shouldn't. Nothing about it felt unusual at first, and that's what made the first sign so subtle. I first noticed it about a mile past the last marked trail, in an area we rarely get complaints about. The bank was soft from recent rain, and that's when I saw the impressions. Boot prints. Not old ones either. The edges were sharp, tread patterns still defined. They weren't the shallow, wandering prints of a lost hiker. They were deliberate, in and out. Same path, same spacing. Whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. That alone wouldn't have set alarms off. We get the occasional fisherman cutting through restricted areas, but these prints led deeper away from open water toward a patch of higher ground that doesn't show up on most public maps. Then I caught the smell. Cigarette smoke. Faint, but fresh. It didn't belong out there. I killed my forward momentum and let the boat drift. The air was still enough that the scent hung in place. On the bank, I spotted a length of rope tied around a cypress trunk. The knot was wrong. Not something you'd use to secure a canoe. It was tight, low, positioned in a way that made no practical sense for fishing. A few yards beyond that, a tree bore a fresh blaze-gleam cut, pale wood exposed. We hadn't marked anything there. That's when routine shifted into something else. I eased the boat onto the bank and stepped out carefully, testing the mud before committing my weight. The ground rose slightly, beyond the sawgrass, forming a narrow strip of dry earth just wide enough for someone to set up camp. And someone had. A tarp was stretched low between the cypress trunks, camouflaged with palmetto fronds. It wasn't the kind of sloppy shelter you see from weekend trespassers. The edges were tucked clean, stakes driven deep. A small fire ring sat in the center, ash gray, but not washed out by rain. I crouched and brushed it lightly with a gloved hand, still faintly warm. There were no personal items scattered around, no beer cans, no torn wrappers, none of the usual mess. Just a compact propane stove, a sealed pack of bottled water, and a folding camp chair position. Facing the narrow path I'd followed in, it looked empty, but it didn't look abandoned. The air felt heavier there, like the humidity had thickened around my ears. I realized I couldn't hear birds anymore. No ibis, no warblers, just the faint buzz of insects and my own breathing. I stood still longer than I needed to. That's when I heard it. Not loud, just a soft dip of water somewhere behind me. The kind of sound a paddle makes when it enters without splash. Slow, controlled. I didn't turn immediately. Instinct told me not to. I let my eyes scan the tree line instead. A shift of shadow where there shouldn't have been one. The faintest movement between trunks. It wasn't dramatic. No snap branch or sudden rush. Just the unmistakable sense of being watched. The camp chair wasn't facing the path by accident. It was positioned to see anyone approaching from the water, and I had walked straight into its line of sight. I took one slow step backward, scanning the ground now instead of the trees. That's when I saw it. A thin strand of wire stretched taut between the saplings, almost invisible against the dappled light. It ran straight across the narrow path I'd just followed in. If I'd taken one more step forward instead of angling slightly toward the fire ring, I would have hit it clean. It was positioned just below my knee. I crouched carefully, tracing it with my eyes. The wire disappeared into the brush on either side, anchored tight. No flagging. No warning, and tied into it, concealed beneath leaves, was a small pulley system rigged to something heavier hidden out of sight. I didn't need to trigger it to understand. It wasn't a trap for animals. It was placed at my height. The realization landed cold and heavy in my chest. Whoever set that line knew exactly how tall a person would be stepping through that path. It wasn't meant to snare deer. It was meant to drop something, to jerk someone off balance, maybe worse, and that's when the Figure stepped out, not from the direction I'd been watching, from behind the tarp. He was too close, closer than he should have been without me hearing him move. Pale skin smeared with mud, shirtless, eyes fixed on me with an expression that wasn't anger or fear. It was calculation. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, blocking the narrowest exit back toward the water. Training takes over faster than emotion does. My right hand moved without me thinking, resting near my sidearm, but not drawing. Escalation in that environment could go sideways fast. My left thumb pressed the radio mic clip to my vest. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need static. I stepped back once, slow, eyes never leaving him. The man didn't advance. He just watched, breathing steady, like he was waiting to see what I'd do. I tried the radio again, angling my body slightly as if that might improve reception. Nothing but broken hiss. We were deep enough in the no-service zone that it didn't surprise me, but the timing did. I didn't challenge him, didn't ask questions. There's a moment in situations like that where pride can get you hurt. My goal shifted to distance. I backed toward the water, carefully stepping over the wire I'd nearly tripped. I kept my voice level, speaking into the radio as if it were working, describing the scene for the benefit of whoever might be listening. When my boot hit mud at the shoreline, I didn't turn my back. I stepped into the boat sideways, pushed off hard with the pole, and didn't look away until the channel widened. I left the camp untouched, left the rope, left the wire. When I finally regained signal and got through to dispatch, my voice sounded steadier than I felt. But even then, I knew something wasn't finished. We went back in that afternoon with backup, to additional officers, a supervisor, and a drone unit from the sheriff's office. The camp was still there when we arrived, but stripped down, the tarp gone, the chair gone. Even the ash from the fire pit had been scattered. The wire trap had been removed cleanly. If I hadn't photographed it on my phone, there would have been nothing to show it had ever existed. We widened the search perimeter, checked for other snares, followed the boot prints until they disappeared into standing water where tracking was pointless. The drone picked up heat signatures from wildlife. Nothing more. No additional camps. No discarded gear. Officially, the report reads as suspected unlawful occupation of protected land. Possible trap intended for poaching. Unofficially, everyone who walked that ground knew better. In the weeks that followed, rumors started drifting in through fishermen and locals who talked more than they realized. Stories about someone living out there year-round. About drifters who camped near the highway and then moved on without saying goodbye. About a man who doesn't like being found. Nothing concrete, nothing chargeable, just enough to make you hesitate before stepping into Sawgrass alone. I still patrol that district. I still log coordinates and check trail cuts. But every time the birds go quiet all at once, I feel it again, that awareness settling in behind my eyes, because somewhere out there, someone knows the land well enough to disappear inside it. And I've never shaken the feeling that he let me leave.
Story 3.
The disappearances by the old crossing. This next one isn't mine directly. It's my grandfather's. He grew up in a small town that sat just north of a wide, blackwater swamp. The kind of place where everyone knew each other and the only road in and out crossed a narrow wooden bridge people simply called the Old Crossing. Back in the early 1950s, when he was about 16, that bridge was the center of everything. Teenagers fished from it. Farmers hauled feet across it. Kids dared each other to walk it alone at night. He told me the story more than once, and every time he did, the details stayed the same. Same names, same weather, same pauses in his voice. He always said it started as a whisper, not a headline, not a public warning, just something people mentioned in low voices at the feed store or after church. A man who didn't come home. A truck found parked along near the crossing. Someone who'd gone down to check a trot line and never came back. At first, it was treated like bad luck, but after the third disappearance, nobody in town called it luck anymore. Back then, the town moved at an unhurried pace. Mornings started with a whistle from the mill and ended with porch lights flicking on one by one. Along the main road, the Old Crossing sat about 2 miles outside town, where the dirt road narrowed and the trees leaned in close. The bridge itself was wooden, weathered gray, with gaps between the planks wide enough to see the dark water moving underneath. On summer evenings, men would park their trucks along the shoulder and cast lines off the side, aiming for catfish that liked to linger in the deeper channel. Kids weren't supposed to be there after dark, but that rule mostly existed in theory. My grandfather and his friends used to ride their bikes out just before sunset, leaning them against the rail and daring each other to look over the edge. When the lights started to fade, The swamp began just beyond the far side of the bridge. Cypress trees rose out of the water, knees breaking the surface like knuckles. At night, the sounds changed. Frogs droned. Something would splash without warning. Sometimes the wind moved through the trees in a way that sounded almost like breathing. Adults would warn the kids not to wander too far past the bridge, not because of ghosts or anything dramatic, just because swamps were unpredictable. At least, that's what they said at first. The first man to disappear was named Carl Benton. He was in his early 30s, worked at the mill, had a wife and a baby on the way. One Friday evening, he told his wife he was heading out to check the lines he'd set earlier that week near the old crossing. It wasn't unusual. Plenty of men did the same. When he didn't come home by midnight, people assumed he'd stopped in town or fallen asleep at a friend's place. By morning, though, his truck was found parked at the edge of the bridge, just where he'd always left it. The keys were still in the ignition. His tackle box sat on the passenger seat. One fishing rod was missing, but there were no signs of a struggle. No scuffed dirt, no drag marks, no blood. Search parties formed before noon. Men fanned out along the banks with lanterns and poles, prodding through reeds and around cypress knees. They dragged hooks through deeper channels, hoping to snag clothing. They found nothing. Not a boot, not a hat, not even the rod. By the second day, whispers started to circle. Maybe he'd slipped and fallen in. Maybe a gator had taken him. But even then, people said something about it felt wrong. To clean, to quiet. For a few weeks, the town tried to fold Carl's disappearance into something explainable. Accidents happen. Water takes people fast. That was the story most folks repeated out loud. Then it happened again. A teenage boy named Everett, only a year older than my grandfather, rode his bike out toward the crossing one afternoon and never returned. His bicycle was found leaning against the same stretch of railing where Carl's truck had been parked. The kickstand was down, one pedal still spinning slightly when they found it, like it hadn't been there long. Search dogs were brought in from the next county over. They tracked Everett's scent down the dirt road, across the bridge, and onto the far bank. Then the dogs stopped, not confused, just unwilling. They circled, whined, and refused to go any farther toward the waterline. Men followed the faint footprints pressed into the mud until they reached the edge. The prints didn't drag or stagger. They simply ended where the bank dipped into dark water. Again, no sign of struggle. After the second disappearance, no one let their children ride near the crossing alone. Men stopped fishing there. After dusk, the place took on a new kind of silence. Lantern light seemed to vanish quicker, and that stretch, swallowed by low-hanging mist that gathered just above the water surface. Searchers spoke about hearing splashes in the distant single, heavy sounds that didn't match the rhythm of fish breaking the surface. When they turned their lights toward the noise, there was nothing to see but rippling water smoothing itself out again. The swamp stopped feeling like part of town. It became something separate, a boundary, and still, people hoped it was coincidence, until the third disappearance made that impossible. The third disappearance was an older man, a retired mechanic who'd gone out in daylight to check a section of fence along the swamp's edge. When he didn't return by evening, there wasn't panic so much as resignation. People gathered with flashlights before anyone even said the words out loud. The discovery didn't happen near the bridge. It happened a half-mile downstream, where fallen timber had collected into a loose logjam against a bend in the current. It was a place most searchers had avoided because the footing was treacherous, and the water ran deeper there. One of the volunteers used a long hook to test the debris. Something caught. At first, they thought it was fabric snagged on bark, but when they pulled gently, the mass shifted in a way wood doesn't. The body was wedged between the submerged trunks, held in place by the current. It hadn't drifted far. It hadn't been carried off by wildlife the way people had assumed the others might have been. There were no dramatic wounds, no obvious signs of an animal attack, but there were marks along the wrists, faint, symmetrical, as if something had been tied there. The implication settled over the crowd slowly, like the mist that rolled off the water at dusk. This wasn't the swamp taking people. Someone had been putting them into it. Once that body was recovered, the sheriff took over personally. Deputies blocked off the crossing for 2 days, running quiet interviews and collecting what little evidence the swamp hadn't already erased. Officially, the statement released to town mentioned possible foul play under investigation. Unofficially, people were told to stop speculating, stop spreading panic, let law enforcement handle it. There were no press trucks, no statewide alerts. My grandfather said it felt like the story was being folded inward instead of pushed outward. Families were advised not to discuss details. Church leaders encouraged calm. The implication was clear. If this was a person, they were likely local or at least familiar with the area. After that, behavior shifted overnight. No more evening fishing at the crossing. No teenagers daring each other to stand alone on the planks after sunset. Even grown men avoided the far bank unless they were in groups. Porch lights stayed on later, and when someone heard a splash after dark, they closed their doors instead of investigating. They never found Carl. They never found Everett's body either, for years. People claimed it was only a matter of time before something surfaced downstream, but nothing did. The water kept moving. Seasons changed, and the evidence that might have answered questions dissolved into silt, and arrest was never made. There were suspects, of course. There always are in small towns. A drifter who passed through around the same time. A man who kept to himself on the outskirts. Someone who knew the currents well enough to choose where to leave a body so it would look accidental. But no one was ever charged. My grandfather used to say the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the uncertainty. Not knowing whether the danger had left with whoever did it, or if it had simply learned to be more careful. The old crossing was eventually rebuilt in the 1970s, concrete replacing wood. The dirt road was widened. The town moved on the way towns do. But even decades later, if you mention the crossing to someone old enough to remember, their voice drops a little, because the swamp gave one body back and kept the rest, and nobody can say for sure whether it was hiding a murder or protecting one.
Story 4.
Something hit the water under me. This last one happened to me and my friend Mark. About 6 years ago, neither of us are thrill seekers. We both grew up around water. I work maintenance for the county now. But before that, I spent most weekends fishing or helping my uncle repair docks along the river. Mark's a mechanic, solid guy, calm under pressure. We've been friends since high school, and if there's one thing we both respect, it's water. We weren't out there doing anything reckless. It was a Saturday morning in early fall, the kind of day where the humidity finally backs off a little and the air smells clean instead of heavy. We'd launched his small aluminum skiff just after sunrise, planning to check a few spots along a quiet stretch of swamp channel. We'd fished dozens of times before. We knew the depth changes, knew where the sandbars hid, knew which bends held gators, and which ones didn't. It was a new territory. That's important, because what happened didn't feel like the result of inexperience. It felt like something else entirely. The morning had that soft gray light that makes everything feel slower. Thin clouds filtered the sun just enough to take the glare off the water. The surface was mostly still, broken only by the occasional swirl where something fed below. Perfect fishing weather. We brought simple gear to medium action rods, a small tackle box with hooks and weights, and a bucket of live shiners we picked up from a bait shop on the way out. Mark kept a cheap portable radio in the boat, low enough that it blended with the background hum. Classic rock drifting in and out between static. His skiff was a 14-foot aluminum hull with a small outboard that coughed a little. Before settling into a steady idle, we eased into one of the narrower channels and killed the motor, letting ourselves drift. The current there moved slow, barely noticeable unless you watched the shoreline slide past. Mosquitoes were around, but not bad. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. Every now and then a gar would roll somewhere in the distance, leaving a widening circle. We talked about nothing important. Work schedules, a mutual friend getting married, whether the bass would move into deeper water once it cooled another few degrees. It felt ordinary, familiar, the kind of morning you don't remember later because nothing goes wrong. That's what made the first shift so subtle. It started with the birds. There had been a steady chatter from the tree-line warblers, something bigger farther off, but it cut out all at once. Not gradually, just gone. The radio was still playing low, and for a second I thought maybe I'd imagined the silence, but even Mark glanced up from his line like he felt it too. A few yards off the port side, the water shifted. Not a splash, not the sharp break of a fish hitting bait. It was more like a slow boil, a patch of surface trembling in a tight circle before smoothing back out. I leaned slightly over the edge, expecting to see a gar roll or maybe a turtle surfacing. Nothing. Then a piece of driftwood, what I'd assumed was a half-submerged log, pivoted slowly against the direction of the current. It didn't spin with the water. It angled deliberately, then stopped. Probably a gator, Mark muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. A few seconds later, there was a heavy slap somewhere behind us. Not the hollow thud of a tail on water, deeper, thicker. I remember thinking it was strange how the ripples spread without anything breaking the surface. And then the boat shifted beneath my feet. My line snagged not long after that. It tugged once, hard enough to bend the rod tip, then went slack. I reeled it slowly, expecting weeds, but felt resistance halfway up. Not the sharp head shake of a fish. Just wait. I'll grab it, I said, setting the rod down and leaning over the side. I've done it 100 times. Reach down, free the hook from whatever root or branch it's caught on. The water looked normal again, dark, still. I slipped my hand just below the surface, feeling for tension in the line. That's when the temperature seemed to drop. The water didn't splash. It tightened. That's the only way I can describe it. The space around my forearm compressed, like something displaced the current all at once. Before I could pull back, something struck from below. Not teeth first. Impact first. The force hit the underside of my arm and chest at the same time, shoving me forward against the gun wall. The boat rocked violently. Water sloshed over the edge. My mind ran through options in a flash. Gator, too abrupt, and there'd be a clamp, a snapping turtle, not that big, a gar, they slash, not ram. Maybe I'd tangled with submerged debris and the current had shifted, but there was no current strong enough for that. Then I felt it, a pull, not constant, not clamped. Something had my wrist. For half a second pressure, without puncture, then released just as suddenly. I jerked backward, scrambling for balance, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear Mark shouting my name. The water beside the boat churned once, hard, then went flat again, as if nothing had touched it. I barely had time to plant my feet before it hit again. This time it wasn't my arm. The entire underside of the skiff jolted as if something massive had rammed it from below. The aluminum hull rang with a deep, metallic thud that vibrated up through my knees. The bow lifted half an inch, then slammed back down. Sit down, Mark shouted, already reaching for the outboard. The boat lurched sideways, dragged just enough to turn us broadside to the channel. For a split second, I thought we were going over. Instinct took over. Drop weight. Lower center of gravity. Don't fight the tilt. I grabbed the bench and shifted down, not caring about pride or balance. Just stability. Something scraped along the bottom of the hull. Not claws, not teeth. It sounded like sandpaper dragged hard across metal. Then the force shifted again, this time downward. The stern dipped sharply, and I felt a tug at my right boot like something had brushed past it under the waterline. Mark cranked the engine without waiting for a clean idle. The prop churned violently, frothing the surface behind us. The boat shot forward in an uneven surge. I didn't look back. You don't lean over. You don't investigate. You don't challenge what you can't see. You leave. The hull vibrated once more, a dull impact that felt less like a strike and more like a warning tap. And then it was gone. We didn't slow down until we were nearly back to the main channel. Mark kept the throttle higher than he ever does in narrow water, scanning the surface behind us like he expected something to follow. I sat there breathing hard, staring at my forearm. There was no deep puncture, no torn flesh, but the skin from my wrist to mid-forearm was scraped raw in a wide, uneven band, like I dragged it across coarse concrete. The edges were inflamed already, stinging in a way that felt wrong for something that hadn't broken skin deeply. We loaded up in silence and drove straight to an urgent care clinic. The nurse asked what bit me. That's the thing, I said. I don't think it bit me. They clean it thoroughly, more for contamination than trauma. Swamp water carries everything: bacteria, parasites, things you don't want inside you. I got a tetanus booster and a lecture about watching for swelling or fever. When we reported it later, it was logged as probable wildlife interaction, maybe a large gar, maybe a submerged log shift. The hull had minor abrasions underneath, nothing conclusive. No one seemed particularly interested, but I knew what common wildlife feels like, and that wasn't it. For weeks after, I caught myself replaying it in quiet moments, the sound of the hull ringing, the way the water tightened around my arm before the impact, the scrape that felt deliberate, not chaotic. I tried to fit it into something logical, a territorial gator bumping the boat, a big, gar misjudging distance, debris shifting under current pressure. But none of those explanations stayed steady when I examined them too closely. About a month later, Mark suggested we go back, not to fish, just to see it again in daylight with clearer heads. Part of me didn't want to. The other part needed to. The channel looked identical. Same bend, same cypress roots pushing out of the bank. The water calm, reflective, giving nothing away. No unusual current, no debris cluster that might have caused a sudden surge. We idled in place longer than necessary. Nothing moved beneath us. No birds went silent. No strange ripples. Just dragonflies skimming and the soft hum of the engine. It felt almost staged in its normalcy, like a room that's been tittied after something ugly happened inside it. We didn't stay long. I still go out on the water. I haven't let that stop me. But I don't lean over the edge without thinking first. I don't reach into dark water blindly anymore, because whatever hit that hole knew exactly where we were, and sometimes I wonder if it misjudged us, or if it simply decided we weren't worth keeping.